If you're an HR professional who works hard to fill roles within your company, keep employees engaged, and build company culture, welcome to America Back to Work, where dreams only work if we do. We'll share wide-ranging issues surrounding pre-employment background screening, HR topics such as recruiting, hiring, labor trends, and company culture, as well as broader HR-influenced business topics such as customer experience, service level excellence, and protecting what matters through best practices in prevention, protection, and corporate security. America Back to Work is brought to you by S2 Verify. Here's your host, Arnette Heintze.
Welcome to America Back to Work, brought to you by S2 Verify, where our purpose is to help you hire with confidence and manage insider risk. I'm your host, Arnette Heintze. Thank you for joining. Today, our guest is Mike Klein. Mike is an internal communications specialist and super connector in the communications industry. Mike is also the author of From Lincoln to LinkedIn, the 55-minute guide to social communication. This is a manual for mobilizing peer-to-peer communications. Mike's specialties are communications, measurement, influence, segmentation, and leadership. Mike, thank you for joining today. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about your career and what led you into the field of internal communications?
Well, that's an excellent question. I've been in internal comms for the last 25 years. And I really discovered it while I was an MBA student at London Business School. I had been working in political campaigns and in political consultancies for about 10 years previous. And I was looking to find a less seasonal and more sustainable set of opportunities to develop my skills and to commercialize them. And so that's why I went to business school. And when I found out about that there was such a thing as internal communication, it seemed like a natural to apply what I'd learned in the political sphere and learn how to cross-apply it and put it to work and bring it to life in the business sphere.
Yeah.
And that's what I've been doing for the last 25 years.
Well, fabulous. Well, I also know that we share a common factor of being a little bit from the Midwest here, but I find it really intriguing that you're in Iceland today. So that's great.
Well, I've been living and working in Europe for most of the last 20 years. And as I mentioned, I also got my graduate education in London. And it's given me a fairly unique perspective on, particularly the nature of the difference between European and American employment mentalities, which I think really drives a very distinct approach to internal communication on both sides of the Atlantic. And it becomes very interesting when you have European subsidiaries of American companies and American subsidiaries of European companies, and how those labor management issues play out in the internal comms implications of those things. And in Iceland, we have a very Scandinavian social model. But if you take a look at Reykjavik actually looks a lot more like an American city than what you would normally expect a place here would be to look at.
Yeah. For the last 30 years, I've found communications, and especially strategic communications, one of the most critical elements of any business or organization. And I'm so pleased that we have this chance to catch up today. So tell me a little bit about, over the course of your career, how has internal communications changed, and what do you think the state of it is in business today?
Well, I think there's two sides of it. And I think the starting point is how little it's changed in many ways. And there's a lot of lamentation in the internal comms world that, we're still talking about the same things. We still have the same questions that we had 25 years ago when I was writing my MBA thesis on internal comms in top UK companies. But a lot of this is because the nature of the employee-employer relationship remains fairly constant even as it evolves. You have messaging top down, you've got relationships between managers, leaders, and employees, and you also have relationships between employees and relationships between employees and customers. And those fundamentals haven't changed. The mechanics have changed, the technology has changed, but to a large extent, the fundamentals haven't changed. And you can see that particularly around tone. And that's also where there's the biggest difference between American-driven and American-led companies and non-American companies. Because outside the U.S., there's a consultation model, there's more unionization, there's legislation that gives workers rights to their jobs, where the at-will employment model that's at play in most U.S. roles, which basically says that the organization can let go of an employee pretty much at any time. That doesn't just change the employment policies, it also changed the tone of the relationship. Because when you have to consult people, you have to address them in a different tone than if you're in a position where you're basically telling people what to do, even if you're not micromanaging every step that they have to do it with.
Yeah. So given your experience of working with organizations and companies around the globe, how do you see them prioritizing and organizing internal communications?
Well, I think a lot of the structures and a lot of the prioritization is kind of driven around administrative convenience than actual optimizing of impact. So you'll see a lot of internal comms people who are sitting in functions, like you have them sitting in HR functions because they're both people functions, or you have them sitting in public relations because they're both communications functions. And the reality is that internal comms is a it's a strategic function with its own rules, its own practices, and its own metrics. And unless you have an internal comms person reporting directly to the CEO, this is going to live uncomfortably under somebody else's portfolio.
Yeah.
And it's more frequently found under HR than I've found than in other portfolios. It's not necessarily a more natural fit. And the key issue with when it's in HR, because I think that's going to be the scope of the conversation today, is that HR needs to recognize that internal communication is first a company function, which is designed to align and support the company in achieving its overall objectives, rather than just simply a mouthpiece for HR and a tool for getting maximum compliance and minimum friction in the employee HR relationship.
Yeah. In my experience and working with a wide range of companies across the globe, I find that, communications is often one of those functions that, they just sparse out, like you said, it just gets split up around the company. So if you're in an organization like that, what does the HR team need to know to ensure that the organization, the company, is getting out consistent communications?
Well, I think there's a number of pieces. I think one, the HR part of the organization needs to make sure that its own messaging and its own its own processes, practices, and messaging are consistent. Because if there is inconsistency that are baked into these things, having the best communication team in the world isn't going to iron those inconsistencies out for you. If you're looking at how internal comms in general needs to, ensure consistency overall in the organization, first, you need some dedicated support. You've got to have somebody, whether it's an internal communication internally hired communication manager, whether it's a fractional internal comms manager, which is actually a model that I recommend highly for organizations that don't think they have enough work for that internal comms person to do, or that can't hire somebody at an appropriate level of seniority. The fractional model, having somebody who's got experience, who can, make sure that the messaging lines up and use the most optimal set of tools for an organization of a given size and a given geographical spread. That's definitely, that would definitely be the best route. Obviously, HR could support that by encouraging the organization to choose that model, as opposed to what's often done, which is just simply assigning this to a junior person and leaving it to them to figure this out. The thing with internal communication is that if you've got somebody who's inexperienced, it becomes an easy way for people to start reinventing wheels. Because somebody who's going to come into this role with no experience is going to assume that the problem is being experienced for the first time and try to fix it themselves, rather than relying on experience and on the wealth of support that's available from experts like me and others who can say, look, we've seen this 500 times. Here's what you can do both to optimize your impact and reduce the administrative burden on the organization.
Yeah, my sense is that, you and I are very much aligned here in that, it's important that a relationship between internal communications and HR team, be strong and be aligned to one another. Any other thoughts from your point of view?
Well, I think the key thing is you got to remember internal communication is a business function, not just an HR function. And the challenge is that you've got competing KPIs. And as long as HR has its own KPIs, it's going to have an incentive to have internal communication support the HR KPIs rather than the CEO KPIs or the organizational KPIs. And, you really have to be conscious about this. One other thing is that HR has a certain level of investment in what it considers the organization, the integrity of the organizational structure. So the organizational, particularly the org chart. The reality is that communication in an organization rarely flows as neatly or hierarchically as that org chart flows. And effective internal communication isn't just top down and bottom up. It's also lateral. So we're talking, business to employee, B to E, employee to employee, E to E, and also the employee's relationship with customers, either formally through the sales channels or informally in the communities, organizations, and societies in which they operate. Internal communication has to take all of these things into consideration. And it's not just simply about open enrollment.
Yeah. So what can HR professionals do to ensure they're working most effectively with the comms team?
I think the most important thing is to listen. Internal communications people have different relationships, different experiences, and listening to where internal communications are makes it a lot easier for internal communications to support the company agenda and as efficiently as possible the HR agenda. The second thing is to co-create rather than dictate. And third is to say yes when internal comms pros are asking for permission or reasonable budgets to sharpen or streamline communication. I mean, this is another problem with having internal comms under HR, is that actually HR tends to have very limited financial resources of its own, and dedicating resources to internal communication versus additional HR support can be a very substantial budget decision for an HR director, when if IC is reporting to a CFO, that the kinds of sums that we're talking about, 4-figure, 5-figure sums, are basically pocket change to the CFO. The other piece that's absolutely crucial is that HR people need to allow internal comms pros to collect their own data. A lot of HR pros believe that they own the data, the internal data collection process, because they own the employee engagement surveys. But employee engagement surveys are uniquely mispositioned to gauge the effectiveness of internal comms because they don't ask the right questions and they don't actually track the messages that are flowing through the organizations. So probably the single most important thing that an HR professional can do is to allow those internal comms pros who are willing to collect and measure their own collect data and measure their own effectiveness, to give them the latitude to do so.
Oh, fabulous. So, what's your suggestion, or how should internal communications and HR teams work together during, news-making events, whether it's layoffs or whether it's, going public or some, crisis of the day? What suggestions do you have there?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. I imagine it's particularly resonant to your listenership, given the risk management side of what you do, because this is actually where the interrelationship between internal communication, HR, and risk management comes into play. And the biggest factor is whether you're going to have communication leaders inside the tent to help shape these events and to game out different scenarios in terms of their risk implications, as well as their opportunity implications. That's critical. So ideally, you want to have internal comms people and ideally external communication people inside the tent before these messages are crafted. You can consciously address the risks, the opportunities, the implications, the potential for disaster that could come when the right message is delivered at the right time, or when the wrong message or the wrong interpretation comes out without any proactive thought. I think the particular thing here is that organizations have a history of communicating promises and practices and principles to their employees. They make news-making decisions which violate those promises and principles. They then incur, quite rightly, the wrath of their employees, perhaps even the wrath of their customers as well, when it becomes clear that they're not living up to their sides of the bargain. Now, there may be some rare instances where there's such commercial sensitivity where you can't include where you can't include somebody inside that firewall or inside that conversation. But bear in mind that whatever the risks are of having somebody in that conversation, they may be dwarfed by the risks of leaving that person out and having that conversation explode when it hits the marketplace.
So, I think internal comm specialists are the first in an organization that often, see or hear harmful communications coming from leadership at the time. What's your suggestion on how, these pros should approach management to have a candid and open conversation about steps to improve this communication?
Well, I think internal communication people need to be proactive about collecting data from their organizations and not just the click rates and open rates that are embedded in the online tools they have. They need to be willing to ask. There's one particular question that internal comms people need to be asking their organizations constantly, and that is, what are the top 3 priorities facing the organization? Because when toxic communication comes out, you can then look at, okay, here's what the gaps are, here's what the opportunities are, and here's how to neutralize that toxicity, or here's how to address it frontally and make it less toxic.
Yeah. So one of the elements that I think the entire world is starting to embrace very quickly is everything related to AI. And we're seeing it impact every aspect of life right now. Have you seen this impact your work or the work of your clients yet?
Well, I've seen a lot of this impact on in the conversation that communication leaders are having with each other and having with their organizations. The problem with it is that most of that chat is about, what is AI going to do to my job, and how can I use AI in my internal communications? And actually, that's the booby prize. Mm-hmm. The real prize right now is to look at how is AI going to affect everybody's job at the same time? Because we're not just looking at changing and modernizing communication tools. We're looking at changing and modernizing communication tools, contracting tools, proposal formulation tools, copywriting tools, marketing tools, engineering tools, legal tools, all at the same time with no governance and unless we can get control of the conversation, without any overriding context. So you've got a multi-dimensional technology change program going on simultaneously in different areas with no governance. This should be of concern to most organizations. But the other piece that should be of extreme concern is that AI is going to shorten and streamline work processes to such an extent that even where there are restrictions on AI's use, because nobody really knows what's happening to the data that's going into these engines, the security implications are astounding. But there are going to be employees who particularly if you're in a bank or a regulated industry, you're going to have employees who are cutting corners, throwing their data into AI so that they can fix something in 2 minutes that would otherwise take 2 weeks. And then data breaches are going to come up, and you'll have situations like with Wells Fargo, where they just got hit with a $1.2 billion fine because because employees have used unauthorized communication tools. This is a major area of operational risk that communications people in organizations need to be thinking about right now.
Yeah. So what's the one thing you would recommend to HR pros to improve their internal communications? If you had to pick one element, what would that be?
Well, I would give you one answer in 3 parts. I think the key thing is that internal communications is not an afterthought. It's a serious strategic business discipline, and it offers risks as well as opportunities that need to be managed. So the key things are A, recognize that it's multi-directional. It's not just simply the distribution of top-down messages. It's B to E, but it's also E to E, and for that matter, E to C, employee to employee, and employee to customer. You've got to be able to recognize that. And then ultimately, wherever possible, unless you've got, really experienced on-site talent, you've got to use external talent, and you've got to make sure that the people who are doing this are trained professionals who understand the business implications as well as just simply how to develop and distribute messages.
So, Mike, before we sign off today, I want to end with the last question that I ask every guest. And it's simply, if S2 Verify were to conduct a background check on you today, would there be any surprises?
Yes, it would lead you back to Bakersfield, California in 1990, where I was working in the same organization as House Speaker Kevin McCarthy.
Oh, very interesting. Very interesting. Well, great. Mike, thank you so much for joining me today. And tell our audience where they can follow you and connect with you and check out your podcast.
Well, I don't have my own podcast. I'm busy. I'm too busy being a guest on other people's podcasts. But you can find me most easily on LinkedIn. Just simply pop in MKLEIN 818. That's MKLEIN 818. And that will take you to my LinkedIn profile, which is the best place to connect with me. You can also reach me at my website, which is www.changingtheterms.com. That's www.changingtheterms.com.
Well, that's great, Mike. Thank you so much for joining us. And now a minute with my partners at S2 Verify. Bill, if you were to give some mentoring or coaching advice to younger colleagues that we work with today, or just people you meet, what might you recommend to them as a thoughtful consideration as they begin their careers?
Well, really, I would suggest that they start their own company, because it's something I wish that we had done, much sooner in our life. But I guess from a professional standpoint, I would say, to Jim's point, work the problem. You're going to have problems, and it's hard not to get emotional about them. But just continue to work the problem. Make sure that your supervisor, to your point, knows what's going on. Don't have any surprises whatsoever. So go early and often to, your supervisor to make sure that they understand what's going on. And then the other thing is just have a good work ethic. At the end of the day, you got to put in 50 or 60 hours when you start out. It's just part of the life, and you'll get ahead. If you're going to, only work 35 hours when you're supposed to be working 40, then you're going to, eventually it's going to end up biting you in the rear.
Yep. Jim, how about you?
Arnette, I take the same tack. The one thing that I've told my son, my daughter, I tell anyone I encounter, we have a culture that we want to choose the easy road. And I counter that to most people I talk to. And I always tell them, your greatest reward will come from choosing the most complex or the most, for lack of a better term, challenging path. You're going to have to work harder. You're going to have to work longer hours. You're going to learn more. You're going to accomplish more. And strangely enough, some of your greatest success, kind of alluding back to Billy, starting a company, it's hard work. But if you look at what comes out of that, the success and the reward, far greater than going, well, I have these 4 paths to choose. This one's the easiest, I'll take it. And you'll accomplish your goal. It'll be relatively easy. And then you'll be looking for, what am I doing next? So I kind of hone in on take the most challenging path that's presented to you or put in front.
For our audience, please tune in next week when we talk with Tanya Jarrett. She's the Chief People Officer at Aldi, about how she has seen HR leadership roles change over the last few years. We'll see you then. And it goes without saying, let's get America back to work, because dreams only work if we do. Mike, again, thanks so much for joining, and look forward to staying in touch.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
If you want to stay abreast of HR, recruiting, and hiring trends, tips, and tools, make sure you subscribe to America Back to Work. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a rating and a review.